Now I understand that you have to speak English, right? I don't know why, in fact. Why don't you learn Hebrew? It's a very it's a very easy language to learn for those who were born there, yes. And if we can learn English, you can learn Hebrew. In January 27, 1945, it's 72 years ago today, when the Soviet armies reached Auschwitz. It's called the liberation of Auschwitz. This is why the United Nations have adopted this day as the International Day of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, like we call it in Hebrew. But we were not there anymore. The Germans had evacuated the Auschwitz camps. Auschwitz was a complex of 45 camps. The Germans had evacuated us 9 days before, in the night from 18 to 19 January, into the Reich, the German Reich, in other camps where we should go on working to help Germany win the war. In January 1945, Germany still wanted to win the war. I know it's incredible, but these are the facts. These are the historical facts. The Germans wanted to win the war in 1945 when they had lost it years ago. And they needed manpower. They needed workers for the camps. They wanted to win the war with the help of the so-called secret weapons they had, the flying bombs, V1 and V2, and they were convinced that this kind of a bomb, a flying bomb, would help them win this war that they had lost, like I said, at least 3 years ago. It didn't help them. Of course it didn't help them. The Western Allies, after the landing in the Normandy, were already entering Germany from the west, and from the east the Soviets massed hundreds of divisions to invade Germany. So they did understand that they couldn't make it anymore, and they decided to evacuate the camps to get the workers, us, from the camps into the camps situated in the German camps. But of course, like I said, it didn't help them. It helped them only, if I can say so, helping. It helped them getting rid of hundreds of thousands more Jews. And there's one story I wanted to tell you before I go, in fact, into the subject of my today's words. I give you this episode, if I can call it an episode, only to show you in what manner the Third Reich has threatened the Jews. I know it's unbelievable, but it did happen. And some of us, not many, are still around to tell the story. We were about 60,000 when we were evacuated from the Auschwitz camps. Another 100,000 had been evacuated months before, so we were left about 60,000. We had to march. They were, of course, in trucks, in cars, horses, motorcycles, bicycles, everything, and we had to march. We had to march in a rhythm, if I may say so, that nobody could keep. And the ones who did not keep this rhythm were shot. And the streets and the roads of Upper Silesia, Auschwitz is in Upper Silesia in Poland, the roads were full of the ones who had been shot by the SS because they couldn't make it. Others just lie down and died of exhaustion. We were not fed, of course. The march lasted about 5 days to Gliwice, in Polish Gliwice, a Polish-German border town. We arrived less than 19,000. The others were left on the roads. And this is why it is called the March of the Dead. In Gliwice, we were herded into freight wagons. 150 people in one freight wagon. You don't have to be very clever in order to understand that there is no room for 150 people in one wagon. Not even to stand there, leave alone sitting. And so we stood there, and the ones who died, and they died rapidly, were standing with us because they couldn't even fall down. There was no room. After a certain while, when this trip went on and on, it was of course freezing cold. There were open wagons. It was in January. After a while, they did have where to fall to, because there were about 2/3 of the prisoners in my wagon who died, if you can call this dying, who died and did fall, and we had where to sit. We sat on layers of corpses, not knowing what will happen to us, because there was no end to this so-called journey. We had not been fed. We had no water for 10 days in this wagon transport, after we hadn't eaten for 5 days before we came from Auschwitz. So when we realized when we arrived at the camp, and we made a little calculation, some of us hadn't eaten for 2 weeks. How could they live? Some of us did live, not many. And one day, when we were sitting there and thinking about not the future, we knew we had no future, about the moment we will be gone. A young prisoner, younger than we were not very old either. I was then about 19. We were not very old either. He must have been 15 or 16 years old. He approached us and he said, "Comrades, please say the Kaddish with us." Kaddish is the dead, is the prayer of the dead. And the religious Jews, the believers, are convinced that the prayer said by at least 10 men should reach the Lord faster and would have more impact on his decisions. So they always look for what we call a minyan, 10 men. We didn't even listen to him. There we sit and we await that, and he talks to us about the Kaddish. So we didn't answer. And then he said again, he was an Hungarian Jew, because he had a very heavy Hungarian accent in Yiddish. He said again, if you say Kaddish with me, I give you bread. When he said bread, we started to listen. We said, where did you get that bread from? He said, when you left Auschwitz, I kept some bread. And we said, show us the bread. And he did show us the bread. From under his pyjama, our uniform, he took really a loaf of bread. And he said, I kept some bread from Auschwitz. And then we said, okay, we say the Kaddish with you for the bread. But can we say Kaddish standing? And can we say Kaddish sitting? Because Kaddish should be said. It's one of the prayers that should be said standing. We are not strong enough to stay like during the Kaddish. And he said, no, we can sit because I myself cannot stay anymore. And we said the Kaddish. And he did distribute the bread. And I munched my part of the bread very fastly, of course. And by munching this bread, I said to him, when did your father die? And he said, that long ago. And I said, where is he? And he said, you are sitting on him. I know, when I tell the story, people so much sometimes stare at me. They don't believe me. By the way, this episode has an end. Some years later, in my newspaper, I'm a journalist, still. By the way, I know it's unbelievable, but it's true. I'm the oldest active journalist today in the world. I'm 91 years old, and I'm working for close to 60 years in the same daily newspaper in Tel Aviv, in the Yediot Achronot, and which shows you that they didn't have any ambitions, because otherwise I would have tried to go maybe into high tech or something like this now. But I don't have any really. I'm not a very big businessman. I'm just a journalist. I was born from a father who was a journalist and a writer, and I will die a journalist. And like I say, when I tell the story, people don't believe me. But like I said, I do have proof. On the day of Holocaust, the Jewish day, the Israeli day, it's in April 19, the day of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. This is the Yom HaShoah in Israel. We have a special edition this day, and I did write the story of the wagon in this special edition. On the same day, I got a call from Haifa, from a man speaking, of course, Hebrew, with a very heavy Hungarian accent. And he said to me, Mr. Klieger, I am the kid from the wagon. And I said, get lost. How can you be a kid from the wagon? This can arrive once in a billion. And he said, I can prove it to you. I'm active in an organization for the Shoah to remind people of what happened. And last week in our bulletin, I wrote the same story you're telling. And I went to Haifa. I met this man. And it was him. He died some 3 years ago from Alzheimer. So this story, like I said, the only story in a billion. But this is not the subject of today. This was only to show you, I say it once again, how the Germans did really treat the Jews. And why? Nobody knows, nobody never will know. And one cannot explain anything. One cannot explain, not Auschwitz. A camp like Auschwitz cannot be explained. And the behavior of most of the Germans, not all of them, but most of them, in the 30s toward the Jews cannot be explained either. And what you cannot explain is how could the most advanced nation at that time in the world, the Germans, how could they follow blindlings and with enthusiasm a sort of a cartoon. Look at Hitler today, listen to him, and then tell me if this can be a man who can, electrize masses. He did. Most Germans did believe in him. And that nobody of them, the third generation, tell you other, because it's true. Their grandfathers and their fathers voted for him in an election. He didn't take power he didn't take over Germany by power. He was elected. How is it possible? Nobody will be ever able to explain it. So what I can do is to tell the stories. I cannot explain the stories. And when I was in a camp in Auschwitz, I have been in more camps than Auschwitz, but Auschwitz was the longest one. The only thing you can do freely was dreaming. And I had 3 dreams. I knew I would never be able to fulfill them. The one was, how will you ever leave this hell on earth? And I was convinced I cannot leave this hell on earth because no Jew was brought to Auschwitz in order to survive. No Jew should have survived Auschwitz. And if he did, it is by miracle. One must be very lucky in order to survive. I was lucky. Very lucky. So my first dream was to be free. And like I said, I was convinced I would never fulfill this dream. My second dream was, should you survive, you will start telling what happened in the camps. You will go on a mission all over the world and tell people what happened. I was not sent by anyone. I decided by myself. I don't get money. I have been in most countries in the world. I'm very lucky that I have a fantastic memory. And I learn languages by listening to the language. And I do speak a few languages, even English. And by the way, I must confess that sometimes I do ask myself, how the hell did you learn English? You never went to England. In fact, you never lived in the United States or an English-speaking country. So where the hell did you pick up the language? I did. How and where, I don't know. But I have a fantastic, like I said, memory. And I hear very well. I did hear very well. I remember every word from 60 and 70 years ago as well, or every expression. So finally, and my third dream was, and if all this will happen, you will try to help the Jewish people to be again an independent nation, to have an independent country like it one had before the Romans sent us for about 2,000 years in exile all over the world. In order to finish with these people, we have survived all this, as many of you know, and I wanted to have this country back, and I decided to become a Zionist. Now I can say proudly today, I reached all my goals. And then came the day where the United Nations decided on January 27, the day of the Holocaust, the International Day. In other words, people all over the world started to think about the Holocaust. The United Nations did more. They helped schools and institutes, money-wise, to teach this subject, to explain this subject, to tell the subject. And it was a success, and a very big success, as you can see today. But this is the present. In fact, it is already the past. How many of us will live in 2 or 2 years in order to speak about the Holocaust, about the Shoah? None. There will be nobody left. And don't give me anything about books and about films, all this, and please pardon my English, it's a nonsense to believe that this can replace the story of somebody who has been there. Because I always say that one who has not lived through the German camps does not know what the German camps were. And so he cannot tell anything about them. He can be a professor in history, a very learned man, he can be everything. But he doesn't know anything about what happened in the German extermination camp. He can't know. He wasn't there. Now, it was an important step taken by the United Nations. And now that we have come to an end, the survivors, is a time the United Nations should go on one step further and adopt, if possible, and I think it is possible, a resolution concerning the future. And this future should be that the United Nations should adopt a resolution that the Shoah, the Holocaust, should be taught the world over, because, my very dear friends, today there are billions of people the world over who don't even know that there was a Shoah, and they should know that there was a Shoah. They should at least when I'm asked, but how will you preserve something in the future about the Shoah, about an event, if I can call it that, in 20, 50, 30 years, this event will not be actual anymore. It could be, like I said, if the United Nations do go one step further. And they should adopt a resolution that would encourage and assist all member states of the United Nations, of course, to teach the younger generations about this horrible chapter in the history of mankind, so one can be sure it won't never happen again. The United Nations should adopt, I hope, by a large majority, should adopt this resolution. The United Nations should engage themselves to help the schools, the organizations, the world over, in all countries, to help them, to give them the money. The subject, Shoah or Holocaust, should be part of a teaching program in all schools in the world. For instance, in the part that's called history, you teach history. Then do teach history and do add the story of the Holocaust. Add that today's Germans, it's not their fault. They were not born when it happened. But what is very interesting is that when I do speak in Germany, and I'm invited a lot to Germany, when I do speak in Germany, I do ask them questions also. My crowd, I ask questions. They ask me, but I ask them as well. And there's the first question that I ask today in Germany is, can some of you, one of you, can you explain to me why antisemitism not only has disappeared with the Shoah, but it's growing by the day in many countries? And why is it growing? What happened again? We are still considered, this small nation is still considered as a danger to the world. We are a danger to the world. We are not even 0.25% of the world's population. How can we be a danger? How could we be a danger then, and how can we be a danger today? So what you should do is also to include in this chapter called Shoah, within the history lessons, you should include also the antisemitism. Because first of all, there must be a reason for antisemitism. I do understand that you don't like your neighbor, then you don't speak to your neighbor. I do understand that you don't want your daughter to be a partner with his son. Then you tell her he is no good. He's a no good family. You look for another boy. Don't go with this boy. I do understand. I do even understand that you're jealous of achievements that the Jews have had in the last years, and there are many achievements. I can give you a whole list. It would take a day. Should I give you the list? This I understand. They're jealous, okay. But this is a reason to slaughter them the way they did, to prepare a plan, to work out everything about this plan, how to get rid of 18 million. We were 18 million in the world, and the Germans wanted to win this war. And when their soldiers sang in their marches, heute gehört uns Deutschland und morgen die ganze Welt. Today we are masters of Germany, and tomorrow we will be masters of the world. They wanted to win, and they wanted to be the masters of the world. Had they been masters of the world, there would be not one Jew left. But it's 3 generations later. Something must have changed. If something doesn't have changed, it must be helped to change. And the United Nations is certainly the right place to help in this change, in changing what's going on. The Jews won't be the victims anymore. This I can guarantee. Like I said, the first decision was very efficient in many schools today. The second decision would be very efficient in all schools in the world, and this would be a real progress. This would be a step forward to finally end the whole story. And like I said, what I try in my many appearances the world over, I've spoken from Sydney to Malta. I've spoken from Hong Kong to Denmark. In fact, there is no country in the world that I have not spoken to, that I was not invited to deliver speeches. Like I said, should I make money from it, I would be a multi-millionaire today. But since I don't take any money, a mission, you don't take money for a mission. And to me, it's a mission. Nobody has sent me on this mission, by the way. I'm not representative of any of the Israeli organizations, of any of the Israeli institutions. No, I'm my own representative. And I must confess that I became quite famous, if you can say so. I have, in fact, all the distinctions one can get by many countries. I did not even finish school. By the way, I was born in Strasbourg. I'm French by birth. It's my mother tongue. I'm an honorary citizen of my hometown. They're very proud about me. I know all this. This is not new for me. What's new is that for the first time I got the opportunity to speak to you, to speak to the United Nations. And this is my last time, I understand, that I can do it. And to end this much too long speech, I should have spoken less, but I have so much to say that I would speak much more, but they don't let me speak much more. Maybe they're right. I did have the privilege to be in this new Israel, in this new homeland of the Jews, from the very beginning. From the very beginning. I was there already in 1947, before the decision of the United Nations, by the way, of the plan of partitions. One half of this, then it was a British mandate. One half should go to the Arabs living there, one half should go to the Jews living there. The Jews accepted immediately, the Arabs did not, unfortunately, and this is why we still have a conflict. But one thing is sure, my days on earth are almost over, but my country will live forever. Thank you.